Hello everyone. Tonight we're going to take a trip somewhere different. Not to the foggy, fragrant world of medieval herbs, but to a place that in the 21st century became a symbol for something truly awful. Verdun, Stalingrad, names that just echo with pointless slaughter. Well, a new name was added to that list: Bakhmut. Before all this, it was a provincial city of salt mines and vineyards. Then, it became the site of the longest and bloodiest battle of the war in Ukraine. Some analysts have called it the most intense battle of attrition this century. From a purely military standpoint, the city itself wasn't worth all that much. So you have to ask, why did Russia sacrifice tens of thousands of men to capture it? And why on earth did Ukraine decide to defend it at such a horrific cost? So, get comfortable. Tonight, we're doing a breakdown of the catastrophic mistakes, the tactical blunders, and the brutal, almost inhuman decisions that turned a minor objective into a meat grinder. This was a battle where the strategic logic of both sides was pushed to its absolute limit, a battle defined not by brilliant maneuvers, but by obscene levels of attrition. To understand what went so terribly wrong, we have to go back to the beginning, back before Bakhmut became a symbol, back when it was just a town sitting in the path of the Russian war machine. It's tempting to imagine Bakhmut has always been this grey, cratered hellscape we see in the news. But before the invasion, this place, known as Artyomovsk back in the Soviet days, was a city of about 70,000 people. It was an industrial hub, famous for its sprawling salt and gypsum mines, and a winery that became a massive producer during the Soviet era. And to be fair, you can see the logic on a map. It sits at a crossroads of a few major highways, making it a potentially useful logistical hub if you wanted to push deeper into the Donbass. Taking it could, in theory, let Russia threaten the much bigger cities of Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. But that's where the theory kind of falls apart. That strategic value was always limited and highly debatable. The city is actually in a small valley, with higher ground all around it, making it a nightmare to defend and a magnet for artillery. And even if an army did capture it, they'd just be facing a new set of heavily fortified Ukrainian lines that had been built up for years. It would be the same grueling fight all over again. Most military analysts agreed. Bakhmut itself wasn't a game changer. The fight for it wasn't born from some brilliant military plan, but from a toxic mix of political symbolism and, well, just battlefield inertia. After Russia's initial shock and awe assault on Kiev failed in spring 2022, the war shifted east. Moscow's new goal was the liberation of the entire Donbass. After they took Syeverodonetsk and Lysychansk, Bakhmut was just the next town on the list. The shelling had been going on for a while, but things really escalated in late July. By the start of August 2022, after pulling in forces from the fallen city of Popasna, the assault on Bakhmut began in earnest. And at this stage, the battle was a choice. For Russia, it was a choice to fixate on this one dot on the map, maybe because they felt they needed a victory. Any victory, to keep up appearances. For Ukraine, it was a choice to stand and fight for a city that, operationally, they could have abandoned. But President Volodymyr Zelensky and his generals made a deliberate, calculated call. They weren't giving up Bakhmut. Instead, they would turn it into a symbol of defiance, a fortress they called Fortress Bakhmut. And it was a decision that would have staggering consequences, as this battle slowly, inevitably, turned into a voracious meat grinder. So the initial push on Bakhmut wasn't really led by the regular Russian army. And this distinction is critical to understanding the absolute horror that followed. It was spearheaded by the private military company, the Wagner Group, run by the ambitious and famously ruthless oligarch Yevgeny Prigozhin. Prigozhin was on a mission to prove that his guys were better than the official army, and to boost his own power in the Kremlin. And his strategy for doing that was breathtakingly brutal. His forces were bulked up by tens of thousands of convicts, recruited straight from Russian prisons. The deal was simple: survive for 6 months on the front line, and you get a pardon. These men, with maybe 2 or 3 weeks of training, were used as disposable human waves. The tactic was as simple as it was monstrous. Small groups of these prisoners would be ordered to attack Ukrainian positions head-on, right across open fields. Their real job wasn't to win, but to die in a useful way. First, they'd exhaust the Ukrainian defenders, making them waste ammo and energy on endless rolling attacks. And second, by drawing fire, they would reveal where every Ukrainian machine gun, mortar and command post was hidden. Then, Wagner's more experienced mercenaries and artillery could hit those revealed positions. A Ukrainian soldier literally described it as fighting waves of zombies. You kill one group, and another one just gets up and starts walking towards you. This relentless pressure, this complete and utter disregard for human life, allowed Wagner to make slow, agonizingly costly gains. They weren't pulling off brilliant maneuvers, they were just burying the defenders under a pile of bodies. Advancing a few hundred meters could cost hundreds of lives, a price the regular Russian military would probably never stomach, but one Prigozhin was more than willing to pay with his prison recruits. Faced with this inhuman calculus, Ukraine made its own fateful decision. Under the command of General Alexander Syrskyi, who was overseeing the Eastern Front, they decided to meet attrition with attrition. Instead of falling back to better, more defensible positions, they decided to make the battle as expensive as humanly possible for the attackers. The logic was cold. Every Wagner fighter killed in the mud of Bakhmut was one less elite mercenary Russia could use somewhere else. Ukraine would trade its ground for Russian blood, using the city as a basin to drain the Wagner group dry. And just like that, the whole area turned into a World War I hellscape. The landscape became a cratered moon, carved up by non-stop shelling and laced with trenches. When winter hit, it got even worse. In November 2022, Russia redirected forces that had just retreated from Kherson in the south and threw them into the fight. The battle escalated, with Wagner pushing hard on the flanks, especially around the nearby salt mining town of Soledar, trying to surround the city. By the end of 2022, the die was cast. Bakhmut had become this vortex of destruction, sucking in soldiers and gear from both sides. For Russia, it was about political pride driven by one man's personal ambition. For Ukraine, it was a grim strategic gamble to bleed its enemy. Neither side could afford to back down, and the meat grinder was just getting warmed up. As 2023 kicked off, Russia doubled down on its plan to encircle the city. The main effort shifted north to Soledar. Taking that town would threaten to cut off Ukrainian supply lines into Bakhmut. After weeks of just brutal, close-quarters fighting, with Wagner using those same human wave tactics, the Ukrainian defences finally broke. On January 25th, Ukraine's military confirmed it had pulled out of Soledar. The northern pincer of the Russian encirclement had snapped shut, and the pressure on Bakhmut's defenders became immense. With Soledar gone, the fight became all about the supply routes. The T0504 highway, which ran west from Bakhmut, became known as the Road of Life. It was under constant Russian artillery fire, a terrifying gauntlet that Ukrainian troops had to run just to bring in ammo and reinforcements, and to get their wounded out. Control of that road, and the muddy fields around it, became a battle within the battle. Inside the city, things devolved into vicious urban warfare. By March, Wagner had fought its way across the Bakhmutka River, which cuts the city in two, and had taken the eastern half. The river became a killing zone. The fighting was often at grenade-throwing distance, a desperate struggle through the skeletons of apartment buildings. The city was just being systematically erased, and it was during this period that the fatal flaw in Russia's whole operation became glaringly public. The feud between Prigozhin and the formal Russian military command, specifically Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and General Valery Gerasimov, exploded. Prigozhin started dropping these profanity-laced videos, accusing the Ministry of Defense of treason. He claimed they were deliberately starving his Wagner forces of artillery shells, causing insane casualties, all to sabotage his success. This wasn't just some logistical spat. It was like a civil war playing out inside the Russian command structure for everyone to see. Prigozhin, who had promised the Kremlin a victory, was now bogged down, his best forces decimated, and his supply lines choked off by his own side. He was screaming that he was fighting the Ukrainian army and Russia's own military bureaucracy. By February, with news of Wagner's astronomical losses spreading, recruitment from prisons reportedly ground to a halt. Prigozhin's private army was being bled white, not just by Ukraine, but by Russian infighting. The Institute for the Study of War noted that by late January, Russia had started plugging the gaps with its own regular paratroopers, a sign that Prigozhin's offensive was running out of steam. By April, Wagner controlled maybe 80% of the city. Prigozhin even hoisted a Russian flag over the ruins of the city hall, declaring Bakhmut captured from a legal point of view. But the Ukrainians were still grimly hanging on in the westernmost districts. The ring was tightening, but it hadn't closed. The city was almost gone, The cost had been staggering, and the operation's internal contradictions were tearing it apart from the inside. The final act of this tragedy was defined by Prigozhin's desperation and some pretty clever Ukrainian opportunism. In early May, Prigozhin completely lost it. He published this gruesome video showing rows of his dead fighters and just screamed at the camera that he would pull all his forces out by May 10th if he didn't get ammo. He sort of walked it back later, but the chaos was obvious, and right at that moment, as Wagner was running on fumes, Ukraine launched its first successful counterattacks. But they weren't trying to retake the city. Instead, General Syrski's forces hit the weakened flanks, north and south of Bakhmut. These areas were now being held by regular Russian army units, who had replaced the depleted Wagner guys. And well, they folded. On May 9th, Prigozhin publicly accused Russia's 72nd Brigade of just abandoning their positions. Over the next few days, Ukraine announced it had liberated square kilometers of territory on the outskirts, creating what they called a semi-encirclement of the Russian forces inside the city. It was a stunning reversal. The besiegers were now in danger of being besieged. Despite this, Prigozhin threw his remaining men into one last push. On May 20th, 2023, he released another video, claiming the complete capture of Bakhmut. The Kremlin jumped on it, and Putin congratulated Wagner and the army on their great liberation. It was spun as a major victory, Russia's first significant battlefield gain in months. But what had they actually won? President Zelensky, speaking at the G7 summit, put it bluntly. You have to understand, there is nothing. They destroyed everything. For today, Bakhmut is only in our hearts. The city was a smouldering ruin, of no immediate use to anyone. Prigozhin himself said Wagner would hand its positions over to the army and pull out by June 1st. The Bakhmut meat grinder, as he called it, had cost his private army over 20,000 lives, half of them convicts by his own admission. US intelligence estimated total Russian casualties in the area were over 100,000. The victory was immediately undermined. Ukraine kept pressing the flanks, eventually taking the strategic high ground around villages like Klishchivka and Andriivka. This gave their artillery fire control over the Russian-occupied ruins below, turning the prize into a trap. But here's the final bitter twist in this story. The cycle didn't stop. After months of this, Russia regrouped and by late 2023 launched its own counterattacks, slowly and bloodily regaining some of the very same ground on the flanks that they had lost. The Great Offensive had culminated not with a breakthrough, but with a bloody Pyrrhic consolidation in a field of rubble, setting the stage for the next round of grinding attrition. The battle for Bakhmut is just a masterclass in how modern warfare can fail. It's a story about ego, miscalculation, and almost unimaginable brutality. If you want to keep digging into these complex, often grim realities of this war, take a moment to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's always fascinating to break down these critical moments together. So what really went wrong in Bakhmut? The simplest answer is that it was a failed operation for both sides, just in fundamentally different ways. It's this monument to how political ego and symbolic obsession can completely override sound military strategy. First, let's look at it from the Russian side. The whole thing was a strategic miscalculation of epic proportions. Russia, and especially Prigozhin, became fixated on a symbolic prize that had very little actual operational value. This obsession led them to adopt tactics of medieval brutality. Using expendable convicts in human wave attacks wasn't a sustainable strategy. It was a depraved solution to a manpower problem that, in the end, destroyed Wagner as an effective fighting force. The cost was astronomical, totally disconnected from the prize. This was all made worse by that fatal internal division. The public feud between Prigozhin and the Ministry of Defense crippled their command and logistics, turning the whole operation into a power struggle fought with the lives of their own soldiers. And in the end, the victory itself was a failure. They captured a ruin, lost all momentum, and immediately found themselves on the defensive in a vulnerable salient. For Ukraine, the picture is, well, a lot more nuanced. Calling their defense a failure is tough, because in many ways it did what it was supposed to do. But that success came at a terrible, terrible price. Ukraine's goal was to use Bakhmut as a killing ground to grind down Russia's offensive power, and specifically the Wagner Group. And in that, they succeeded. They held on for over 9 months, inflicted massive casualties, and bought precious time to train new brigades for their own counter-offensives. When the city finally fell, it was a tactical loss, but they immediately pivoted and turned the Russian victory sour. Yet, the cost was immense. Ukraine poured some of its own best units into that meat grinder, and they suffered heavy losses too. A debate raged among Western analysts, and reportedly inside Ukrainian command. Was holding Bakhmut worth the blood of so many of Ukraine's best defenders? Was it smart to play a game of attrition against an enemy with a much larger population? Ultimately, Ukraine's defense of Bakhmut wasn't a blunder, but a brutal, calculated and horrifically costly gamble. It was a strategic success, achieved through tactical defeat and an immense amount of human suffering. In the final analysis, the Battle of Bakhmut became a failed operation because it lost all connection to rational military goals. It morphed into a political battle of wills, a thorn that Putin felt he had to remove, and a fortress that Zelensky felt he had to defend. For Russia, it showed that victory at any cost was the goal, even if that cost was strategic bankruptcy. For Ukraine, it showed a willingness to endure almost unimaginable punishment to exhaust its enemy. Bakhmut won't be remembered for who won, but for the profound failure of strategy that turned a city of salt mines into a vast open grave.